Good morning. Good morning. How are you? Thank you for joining us today. I see I only have 4.5 minutes left, so I'll have to talk quickly. I'm sure the clock is wrong. I hope the clock is wrong. I'd like to start today and tell you about the numbers, share with you the numbers of a fantastically successful business from a financial perspective. It's very tightly controlled. The financials are very tightly controlled. They know the exact costs of the product. They know exact cost of acquisition. They know their revenue. They have it burned down to a per product unit cost and a per product unit revenue. Each product can generate about $135,000 in revenue a year. The cost of those goods are very cheap. They're very easily accessed, very easily sourced, and very cheap to buy. They pay no tax, and they generate about a 70% operating profit margin. I'm sure based on the title and the introduction, you know I'm talking about the human trafficking industry. Specifically in this case, this is the human traffic industry that supports the sex trade. And this is the revenues and the profitability that one girl can produce for their syndicate in a single year. But of course, we can't tell the story of cost of goods sold with numbers. We have to tell it with people. And I want to tell you the story of Maria. Maria's a real person. This isn't her picture. She's from a small town in Mexico. But don't kid yourself that it happens in third world countries only. It happens everywhere around the globe. I'm sure right here in Washington, D.C., and I'm sure in the town and city where you're from as well. Maria came from a very dysfunctional household, very mistreated. She was lured away at the age of 12 by a 22-year-old male. He had a nice car. He was nice to her. Bought her food, clothing, made her feel special, and after a couple weeks, convinced her to leave home and move with her. She left town. He moved her to a different city, kept her safe for a little bit. She realized something was odd about the situation, asked him about it, and about 2 months later, forced her to have sex for money for the first time at age 12. For 4 years, Maria was moved around to different cities. Horribly, she estimates that at the peak of her captivity, she was forced to have sex up to 30 times a day. 4 years into this, she was finally rescued by an NGO that was interested in operations, focused on operations to secure the victims of human trafficking. They pulled her out of this organization. She was in a safe home, a recovery home for about a year. Today she's 23. She talks actively on her time in captivity to government officials, religious leaders, NGOs, anybody that has an interest in the topic. Unfortunately, this is not an issue of a single victim. This is an industry. This is a big industry. This is a lucrative industry. And while human trafficking accounts for about 70% of the profits and revenue the sex trade accounts for about 70% of the profits and revenue in human trafficking. It only accounts for about 10 to 15% of the people who are trafficked around the globe each year. The estimates are that 10% of the workers in the agriculture and fishing industries are in fact slaves. 15% of the people in manufacturing business are held against their will. 20% of the people in the construction industry are also slaves. And 25% of domestic workers around the world, 1 in 4, are also held against their will. This is a horrific business, and you have to ask yourself, why in the world would anybody do this to another human being? Well, simply, if you look at the numbers, it makes the explanation fairly clear. This is a business that generates $150 billion in profit every year. While 2/3 of that is from the sex trade, the other $50 billion is from other forms of human trafficking. This is obviously a horrendous impact on our society. Financial services firms, if you're a director of a financial services firm, your company is required to submit reports when you find suspicious activities suspicious transactions going through your organization. About 2 million of these SARs are submitted each year. Only 0.5%, less than 10,000 of those 2 million, identify transactions that are related to human trafficking. less than 10,000. My estimate is that maybe that totals $100 million in transactions, maybe $150 million, nowhere near the $150 billion that's going around the world. There are two reasons for this failure. One reason is the technology itself. This is such a complex money laundering scheme that is built to be so opaque that the existing technologies are simply not up to the task. They cannot find this money. They're old rules-based technologies, legacy technologies that do very good at what they are trained to do, but it is dumb code that says, if this happens, then this happens. There is not a cognitive computing component to it. They miss about, the estimates are, industry estimates are, about 75% of all instances of financial crime that go through them, these technologies. The second reason we miss these, specifically related to human trafficking, is unfortunately, we're not even looking. It's a scary thought, but we're not even looking, these technologies. What I mean by that is these are often small dollar transactions. These are cash transactions that are deposited in an ATM at all hours of the day. These technologies have a threshold for what it is that they look at. These transactions oftentimes fall below the threshold. So we're not even looking for the human trafficking piece component of this. The good news is there is the transformation that is going on with artificial intelligence and big data technologies. This is in play right now. We're at the first inning of it. It's nascent. There is a huge amount of progress yet to be made with these technologies, but it is going to impact this industry, this business, this horrible business. We're going to choke these people off. We're going to make this riskier. We're going to make this more expensive, and we're going to catch more people through it. So this is a simplified version of a very complex case. This is a real case that was tried in New York. $150 billion around the industry is simply too much money to move around in bags. They have to get it into the financial services ecosystem. And when they get it in, they have to move it around to make it look legitimate so that they can use it. This is that simplified version of a single case that was identified, caught, and brought to trial. The head of the operation was a gentleman, excuse my words. Head of the operation was a scumbag that insulated himself from law enforcement by the establishment of a series of companies and by the setting up of a hierarchical structure. He never spoke to victims. He never spoke to customers. He had people doing that work for them. He was very good at obfuscating who he was. He had a driver that worked for him, he had a dispatcher that worked for him. The dispatcher put ads online, took calls from potential customers, negotiated prices, and delivered those customers to the appropriate hotel room. The dispatcher also moved the victims around to different areas, different lodging, different cities as appropriate. That dispatcher had a series of drivers working for him that worked with the victims and moved the victims. The dispatcher also controlled the money, told the drivers where to deposit the cash, sometimes had the victims to deposit the cash, told them which accounts to put it in, how much to put in, what times to put that cash in. The dispatcher had that series of drivers working with them. The person that laundered the money was practiced at how to hide the monies, how to move it, how to make it look legitimate. Generally 4 schemes that person used to do that, move that money around. One was move money offshore, let it sit for a bit, move it back into an onshore account. Another way was to move the money between these 2 shell companies, making them look like legitimate business transactions. Third way was to take cash withdrawals out of a system, out of an account, turn around right away, make a deposit into a separate account. And then the fourth way was to take cash and buy real estate, hold the real estate 3-6 months, sell it, sometimes at a gain, usually at a loss, didn't matter to them. They were just trying to get the money moved around. Artificial intelligence can now take this and look at this as pieces of a puzzle. The ability to have a cognitive computing engine that can see little breadcrumbs, little pieces of a puzzle, and to be able to coordinate and see all of that as one whole action is something the technologies can't do today. It requires humans today. It requires intuition, knowledge, and experience to do it. But the humans never get to look at it if the technologies don't identify it. Now, we know how this works. We've all watched crime shows. Law enforcement sees a street criminal or sees a victim, does an investigation to make an arrest and an interrogation. In that interrogation, they try to get that street criminal to flip around and tell about the boss. They try to get the street criminal to give them information on the account so they can pull financial records and they can piece together supporting evidence for the crime. What I'm here to tell you today is that this is the change that is going on in this business, in my business. This is the change that we are driving into the financial services industry. We can now be proactive. We can now look at transactions using cognitive computing technologies, and we can now see this case. We can now see the syndicate, and we can see all of the players inside that syndicate. We do not have to wait for a victim to be identified on the street to be able to identify this crime anymore. There are three primary ways to do that. Well, in this case, there are three ways to do it. There are multiple ways to do it. There are three ways that I want to share with you. One is the shell companies themselves. One of these, in this case, was set up as a plumbing supply company. The other one was a management consulting company. Management consulting companies don't buy that much in plumbing supplies. But the volume of transactions going between these two organizations, the size of the transactions, the velocity of moving money back and forth indicated some sort of economic justification, some sort of economic purpose that just does not exist between these companies. This can now be identified with artificial intelligence technologies. Secondly, that money coming in and out of real estate, that cash, these were generally $250,000, $500,000 cash transactions. This was a person that had a legitimate employment in the retail industry with a meager wage, but was acting in a way that a professional real estate investor might act. The volume of the purchases and the sales was not somebody that with a job in the retail industry with meager wages would engage in. And then thirdly, common ownership between the two companies. Research on the deep web, research on open sources found that these two companies were actually owned by the same person, had the same management. All those pieces to the puzzle, common ownership between shell companies, no economic purpose in the transactions, cash movement in the real estate, put pieces of a puzzle together that would allow this technology now to identify this crime. Now, unfortunately, like Maria was not the entire story of human trafficking is not the entire story of financial crimes. The world is awash in illicit money, and human trafficking is a very, very small piece of that. Upwards over $3 trillion of money is laundered each year around the globe. These are the worst criminals, these are the worst scum that we have ever had on the face of the earth doing this work. This work supports the drug trade, the sex trade, terrorism, and the lifestyles of the people that are doing it. And we can now stop it. We can now stop it with these technologies. So I founded QuantaVerse to do just that. I founded QuantaVerse to develop a technology that we can identify financial crimes and we can proactively bring these people to justice. My colleagues and I every day go into work knowing that that is what we're doing. We're going to do something to make it a little harder, a little riskier, and a little more expensive. Hopefully someday a lot more expensive, a lot riskier, and a lot harder for the criminals to move this money around the world. It's what we do. It's what we're motivated by. It's our mission. So what is it that you can do? I think in this room, it's arguably the largest gathering of the most influential people in the world. You have connections. You have connections with other directors. You have connections with management of our most important corporations. You have connections with legislators. First off, recognize that in this case, there is a direct alignment between what is right and what is good. Doing the right thing for your company to ensure compliance efforts are in place, audits efforts are in place, they're well-resourced, they have the right leadership, they're motivated to do the right job, is doing the right thing for your company. And it is also doing the good thing for the world. Secondly, tell others, tell other directors, tell your management, ask your management the metrics of how they're trying to make sure that this does not get through the organization. And then lastly, just refuse to allow your companies to be unwitting participants in letting this money flow through the system in the globe.